It began quietly, almost by accident. 10,000 years ago, when people planted the first fields and built the first granaries, the sound of chewing in the dark became their constant companion. Then, from the dry lands of Africa, came a silent visitor, the wildcat. It did not ask to be tamed. It simply appeared, graceful and unimpressed, drawn by the promise of easy prey. Humans watched and, for the first time in history, tolerated a creature they could not control. The cat stayed because food was plentiful, and the humans allowed it because the rats were not. From that uneasy truce grew the oldest contract in civilization, a partnership built on quiet indifference. Generations passed, and the sharpest claws softened. The cats that hissed less survived longer. The humans who fed them felt strangely calmer. A look, a purr, a still presence by the doorway became enough. Without effort, the cat moved from hunter to companion, from the shadows of granaries to the corners of homes. In ancient Egypt, it became an icon of beauty and balance. In Greece and Rome, it lounged among marble and sunlight, part worker, part ornament. As ships began to cross seas, cats followed, sleeping beside ropes and barrels of grain, carrying their calm to every port the wind could reach. Far to the east, other cats lived among rice fields and open barns, smaller, wilder, and equally disinterested. Two worlds of felines evolving separately, yet bound by the same logic. The less they cared, the more they were welcomed. In time, trade and travel merged their lines into the modern house cat, a creature half wild, half wise, entirely self-sufficient. Through centuries of worship, superstition, and survival, cats endured without ever surrendering their silence. They watched empires rise, plagues pass, and cities rebuild, always returning to the same place. The edge of human warmth, close enough to share it, distant enough to keep their mystery. Even now, when one curls at your feet or blinks slowly in the dusk, it carries that ancient calm. It reminds you that coexistence doesn't need devotion or command, only space, patience, and the quiet understanding that some companions choose us simply by staying. 10,000 years ago, long before fences and villages, there was only a stretch of land soft with grass and wind. Somewhere in that vast plain, a human knelt down and pressed a few seeds into the soil. It was an act both ordinary and revolutionary, a quiet challenge to the way the world had always worked. For the first time, people were no longer just wanderers, they were stayers. They built small shelters from reeds, shaped clay jars for storing grain, and began to listen to a new kind of rhythm, the rhythm of waiting. But where there is grain, there are guests. The first storage pits filled not only with harvest, but with the rustling of tiny lives. Rats and mice, clever, tireless, uninvited. They found the new human settlements irresistible, warm walls, endless food, and no natural predators. At night, the people could hear them in the dark, the scratching, the chewing, the soft thuds of tiny feet across woven mats. Civilization, it turned out, had a heartbeat made of pests. Then one evening, another shape appeared at the edge of the firelight. It moved differently, low, fluid, and silent. Its eyes reflected the flames with an old, golden intelligence. The African wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, had arrived. It came not out of loyalty or curiosity, but because instinct had led it there. The scent of grain brought rats, and the scent of rats brought cats. The people didn't call it friend, they didn't even have a word for it. But they noticed. When the wildcat passed, the noises in the dark grew quiet. When it lingered near the granary, the grain stayed safe. It hunted with an elegance no trap could match. Patient, still, and absolute. The humans began to leave scraps nearby, a small offering of respect or perhaps a bargain. You keep the rats away, we'll keep the fire warm. There was no ceremony, no moment of taming. No one ever tied a rope around its neck or tried to teach it tricks. The cat simply stayed. Sometimes for a night, sometimes for a season. It came and went like the wind, and yet, across generations, that fragile arrangement deepened into something remarkable, a relationship built not on command, but on convenience. At first, the cats were cautious, wild eyes always watching. They hissed when touched, darted away at sudden sounds, and fought over territory. But the humans learned too. They stopped chasing them away. They spoke more softly. They understood that trust with such a creature was earned in silence, not through force. Over time, both sides changed, just enough to coexist. The cats that tolerated people, the ones who didn't attack or flee, found easy food, shelter from storms, and a life safer than the open desert. The humans who tolerated cats found fewer diseases, less spoiled grain, and a strange, comforting presence by their doorways. Each benefited without surrendering. It was evolution by compromise. No one domesticated the first cat. The cat simply learned how to live with us. In that, it revealed something profound about adaptation. That survival doesn't always require control. Sometimes it only asks for understanding. As the years passed, the wild edges softened. Kittens born near villages grew up hearing human voices, smelling smoke, and sleeping in the warmth of huts. They learned to read gestures, to know which hands offered food and which threw stones. The bravest among them lingered closer to campfires, eyes half closed, tails twitching lazily, pretending not to care. For the humans, these moments became familiar. A cat stretching by the doorway, a flash of movement through the tall grass, a small shape slipping between the jars at dusk. It became part of the landscape of their new life, as constant as the wind, as untamed as the land itself. Perhaps the first time someone tried to pet one, it didn't end well. A quick swipe, a sharp hiss, a lesson learned about boundaries. Yet even that became part of the understanding. You don't own what you respect. And so the two species continued their silent truce, each believing they had the better end of the deal. The cats hunted the rodents that threatened the crops, and in return, the humans offered scraps and shelter. But beneath that practical arrangement, something subtler grew, an emotional connection that neither side fully intended. When the wildcats' kittens played in the dust, children laughed. When one disappeared, the absence felt oddly heavy. That was how it began, not through domination or breeding, but through gentle proximity. Over countless generations, the fiercest cats moved away from people, and the calmer ones stayed. Slowly, quietly, nature selected for coexistence. This was humanity's first experiment with partnership. Not a partnership of equals and not one of power, but of tolerance. The cat didn't change to please us, and we didn't change to master it. Instead, we adjusted our habits just enough to share the same space without conflict. That was the beginning of domestication, not through ownership, but through patience. By day, the cats wandered through fields, stalking the edges of tall grass where mice hid. By night, they slipped into the glow of firelight, curling near the warmth as people told stories. Their eyes shimmered in the dark, catching every spark. The humans began to associate that stillness with calm, that soundless grace with luck. Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps it was affection. Either way, the cats had secured their place. It's easy now to imagine that moment, a quiet night, a handful of farmers resting after a long day, the smell of grain and smoke in the air. Beyond the flicker of the fire, two eyes gleam. Not threatening, not afraid, just watching. The people glance back, tired but unafraid. Somewhere between those glances, the distance between species shrinks. The next morning, a child leaves a bit of leftover food on a flat stone. The cat appears, eats, and vanishes. The ritual repeats the next day and the next. A rhythm begins, not friendship, not ownership, something gentler, coexistence. The cats who stayed passed their calm to their kittens. The ones who ran vanished into the wilderness. Slowly, over hundreds of seasons, the wildcat became something slightly different. Its fur patterned to match the fields, its temper softened by habit. It still hunted, still wandered, but it no longer feared the human voice. In this way, domestication wasn't a single event, but a conversation stretched across millennia. A wordless understanding passed from one generation to another. Each side shaped the other in small, invisible ways. The farmers learned to see value in what they couldn't command. The cats learned that indifference could be a form of power. The result was a relationship unlike any other, not driven by loyalty, like the dogs, nor by need, like the oxes, but by quiet agreement. That agreement has lasted to this day. You can still see it in the way a cat glances at you without blinking, the way it occupies your space as if it were its own, the way it accepts your affection as a favor to you, not a right. It's a trace of that first meeting between firelight and eyeshine, between hunger and patience. So much of civilization has been about control, shaping land, breeding animals, organizing chaos. But the story of the cat reminds us that not all progress comes from power. Some comes from stillness, from letting another being exist beside you, untamed yet welcome. As villages turned into towns and towns into cities, cats followed the grain, the markets, the alleys. They adapted without ever truly changing. Whether in mud brick homes or marble courtyards, they played the same role they always had: guardian of the harvest, keeper of calm. And in the quiet between human footsteps, they continued to live by their own rules. A reminder, perhaps, that coexistence doesn't need to be loud or declared. It only needs time, patience, and the willingness to let silence do the work. In the end, the partnership that began in a field of grain became one of the most enduring in history. We thought we had tamed the wildcat, but the truth is simpler and perhaps more beautiful. The wildcat taught us how to share the world. And so the quiet understanding endured, a small agreement between two species that never needed words, only time and patience. Over time, the fields expanded, and with them, the rhythm of human life. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and yet the agreement remained unchanged. The cats continued to appear at the edges of human settlements. Small, self-contained silhouettes moving between light and shadow. They asked for nothing, but everything about them implied a quiet expectation. Food left near the door, a place to sleep, tolerance in exchange for control of the night. Humans, meanwhile, adapted without realizing it. They built thresholds and corners that seemed made for feline rest. They learned to interpret the twitch of a tail, the slow blink of gold-green eyes, the deep, vibrating sound that meant satisfaction. The cat's indifference became part of daily life, a reminder that not everything useful must be obedient. As the generations passed, that mutual understanding deepened into habit. It was not affection as humans knew it, nor submission as they demanded of other animals. It was a calm coexistence, woven through centuries of shared survival. The cats kept the rats at bay, the people provided warmth and shelter. Neither side pretended it was love. And yet, something in that distance became beautiful. At dusk, when smoke from the hearth curled into the air and the world slowed, a cat would settle by the doorway, silent but present. Its stillness mirrored the mood of the evening, the calm between effort and rest. Children grew up seeing that shape in the fading light, and they began to feel that life was right only when such a creature was near. Eventually, the image of the cat slipped into the collective imagination. Pottery bore its curves, woven cloths depicted its elegant pose, stories were whispered about its balance and grace. In some lands, it became a symbol of patience and watchfulness. In others, it was a quiet guardian of the home, a presence that kept misfortune away simply by existing. The truth was simpler. People admired what they could not command. Cats did not beg, they did not bark or pull carts or guard doors. They seemed to live for themselves, and somehow that independence comforted those who watched them. It was as if the animal carried a calm that people longed for, but could never fully keep. When trade spread across seas, ships brought not only spices and grain, but also small, soft passengers curled up beside ropes and barrels. Mice followed the cargo, cats followed the mice. They walked onto the decks of the ancient world as silent workers, maintaining the balance between order and chaos. Sailors fed them bits of dried fish and considered them good luck, though luck was never what cats dealt in. They were simply efficient and unbothered. From one port to another, from the sunlit coasts of the Mediterranean to the crowded docks of new empires, cats traveled farther than most men ever would. They arrived in foreign lands as they always had. Without fanfare, without permission, simply stepping ashore as if they already belonged. Wherever grain was stored, wherever people gathered, they made their quiet homes. In time, new kinds of admiration grew. Artists painted them resting in sunbeams, poets described them as shadows with hearts of still fire. A few rulers even decorated their halls with statues of cats, not because they were useful, but because their poise seemed eternal. Humans, surrounded by their own noise, found peace in the company of something that refused to hurry. But history, like the sea, shifts with the tide. There came darker centuries, times when fear disguised itself as faith and misunderstanding spread faster than reason. Cats with their night-colored fur and glowing eyes became targets of suspicion. People saw mystery and mistook it for menace. In village squares and candlelit churches, the same animal once admired for its composure was suddenly accused of being unholy. The result was cruel and predictable. Villages burned what they didn't understand. Cats disappeared from streets and barns, retreating into forests and ruins. The silent contract, broken by superstition, collapsed into chaos. Without their hunters, the rats returned in swarms. Grain spoiled, diseases spread, and a great shadow swept through the towns, the plague. It was not the devil that had come, but nature correcting an imbalance. Years passed before people noticed the pattern. The places where cats still roamed suffered less. The towns that had destroyed them suffered most. Slowly, shame turned to caution. Families began to feed strays again, at first in secret, then openly. The animals returned, lean but alive, stepping back into the world as if nothing had happened. Their indifference was absolute. They neither forgave nor accused. They simply resumed the work they had always done. By the time the storm of ignorance cleared, cats had reclaimed their place in human life. They became symbols again, at this time not of divinity, but of resilience. They had survived without pleading, endured without submission. To live beside them was to remember that strength can be quiet, and that endurance does not always roar. Through the Renaissance and beyond, the cat's image softened once more. Painters placed them in domestic scenes, sleeping beneath tables, stretched across window ledges, or playing near children. Scholars kept them in studies to guard manuscripts from mice. Sailors still carried them across oceans, now as both workers and companions. Wherever humans built, cats followed, graceful witnesses to our noise and ambition. And in all that time they never changed much. Their bodies grew smaller, their colors more varied, but their nature stayed the same, half wild, half wise, never fully ours. Centuries later, when cities rose and the world filled with machines, cats continued their ancient rhythm. They moved through alleys and gardens as though nothing had altered. In apartments high above the streets, they slept through the day and roamed by night, as their ancestors once did in fields of grain. Humans came home to find them waiting at the door, not in devotion, but in the quiet assurance that some things endure. Perhaps that is why people still keep them close, not for protection or service or even love in its loudest form, but for that rare reminder of calm. A cat asks nothing but space. It listens without reply, watches without judgment, and teaches by example that comfort can exist without control. The silent contract that began 10 millennia ago remains unbroken. It exists in every soft paw that crosses a floor, in every slow blink exchanged between species. It's written not in ink, but in routine. A bowl filled, a presence returned, a purr that hums like the echo of ancient fields. So when you see a cat resting in a patch of sunlight, eyes half closed, you are watching history at ease. Beneath its stillness lies the story of humanity's first partnership, one that required no words, no leashes, and no promises, just understanding. That understanding carried across continents and centuries, shaping more than human comfort. It taught us patience. It reminded us that peace does not always mean stillness, but coexistence. In every era, cats have been both near and apart, at the edge of our warmth, sharing it, but never surrendering to it. And maybe that's the secret of why we love them. They never tried to be what we wanted. They stayed what they were, and we learned to soften around them. Tonight, as the world quiets and the lamps fade, somewhere a cat curls into itself, small against the vastness, content in its chosen silence. The wind moves softly through the open window, and the same old rhythm hums beneath it. A rhythm that began in fields of grain, in the first faint agreement between watcher and watched. The night deepens, the contract holds. Over countless seasons, something quiet began to shift. The wildcat that had once watched from the edge of the firelight started to understand the human rhythm, the sound of footsteps, the crackle of kindling, the way hands reached out not to strike, but to offer. And among those wild eyes, some learned a new kind of patience. Natural selection favored not the strongest hunters, but the calmest observers. The cats that could linger near people without fear found food, warmth, and safety. Those that stayed wild disappeared back into the grass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, instinct gave way to expression. The animals that once hissed now blinked, the ones that bolted now paused, their bodies softening into curiosity. A few learned to tilt their heads just so, to open their eyes wide and hold a gaze. They discovered that humans, for reasons even they could not understand, melted at the sight. The faint rumble of a throat became music in the quiet of the night. It was not affection in the way people imagined, but strategy refined by time. Yet somehow it worked both ways. Humans, busy shaping the world, found their hearts shaped in return. The cats did not become pets overnight. They remained sovereign creatures, half wild, half willing. Their world was still measured in scent and silence. But they had learned something extraordinary, that emotion could be a tool and expression, a kind of language. The slow blink, the small stretch, the deliberate indifference, all were gestures honed by evolution, designed not to please, but to coexist. People, for their part, began to see personality where once there had been instinct. A cat's stare felt like judgment, its purr forgiveness. The truth was simpler, but no less beautiful. Every look and sound was communication in its rawest form, a conversation between two species that had never shared a word. The genome of the modern cat still carries the wilderness within it. More than 90% of its DNA remains unchanged from its desert ancestors. It remembers the hunt, the solitude, the moonlit stillness. But layered over that wild code is a thin, elegant veneer of adaptation. An understanding that softness can be power, that stillness can feed survival. The eyes became rounder, the voice softer, the movement slower. Each change, small as it was, deepened the bond. What began as mutual tolerance evolved into a strange companionship. Humans reading meaning into glances, cats learning to perform them. They didn't lie, they simply learned to survive with grace. In every village and every century, this quiet dialogue repeated itself. The cat would approach, careful but unafraid. The human would pause, extending a hand, hesitant yet hopeful. Between them hung a moment of recognition, fragile and timeless, a memory of all the others who had made the same attempt beneath the same sky. Over time, the gestures became ritual. A bowl left by the door, a hand reaching down at dusk, a purr rising like a low hum, soothing both the giver and the receiver. It was as if two very different hearts had found the same rhythm, one that pulsed not with need, but with mutual understanding. The cat did not become less wild, it simply became fluent in coexistence. And in that fluency, it taught humans a lesson they had long forgotten, that connection does not require control. Sometimes the deepest bond comes from allowing something to remain slightly out of reach. Even now, in living rooms and city alleys, the same conversation continues. A cat meets your eyes, holds them for a heartbeat, then looks away. That moment, brief, wordless, perfect, is the echo of millennia. It carries the memory of dust and moonlight, of grain and fire, of the first human who waited patiently while a creature of the wild decided to stay. Science calls it domestication, but the word feels too rigid for what really happened. This was not ownership or obedience, it was evolution wrapped in patience, a shared experiment in trust. Every purr is the sound of an ancient truce reaffirmed. Every stretch in a patch of sunlight is history made flesh. Across the centuries, the cat became more than a hunter. It became a mirror, reflecting humanity's longing for calm, its hunger for grace. While people built walls and empires, cats slipped through them untouched, belonging everywhere and nowhere. Their presence softened the edges of human life, reminding us that serenity can exist amid chaos. They adapted to our moods as much as we adapted to theirs. When the house was loud, they vanished into quiet corners. When the night grew heavy, they appeared, curling beside us with unspoken assurance. They never promised comfort, yet they offered it endlessly. And we, grateful without knowing why, accepted it as if it were love. Perhaps that is how evolution really works. Not through domination, but through the gradual weaving of empathy into survival. The cat learned to read us, and we learned to slow down enough to be read. In that balance lies the secret of coexistence. Even now, when a cat brushes against your leg or settles on your chest, it is not submission you feel, it is continuity, a thread stretching back 10,000 years, connecting field to hearth, desert to apartment, instinct to expression. Its eyes may close, its breathing steady, but beneath that calm lies the wild pulse of its ancestors. And in that moment you are part of something ancient and unspoken. You have become, if only briefly, the other half of a very old equation, the one that began when a creature of the night decided that survival was sweeter when shared. The cat is still wild, it only hides it well. It walks softly, pretending to belong, but its heart still beats to the rhythm of freedom. It kills not for hunger, but for memory. It purrs not for flattery, but for balance. The human world, full of noise and haste, bends unconsciously around this small, silent presence, the same way villages once bent around fields of grain. So much has changed, languages, cities, the shape of time itself. But the cat's lessons have not. It teaches by example, to move quietly, to want little, to guard your solitude as something sacred. Its gaze, unhurried and inscrutable, reminds us that peace isn't found in obedience, but in being fully oneself. And as the night deepens, the same story repeats. Somewhere, a cat watches the movement of shadows on a wall. Its tail flicks once, twice, then stills. It listens to the soft rhythm of human breath, to the distant hum of the world turning. It closes its eyes, not out of trust, but out of knowing, because this moment, this shared silence, is the truest form of survival. The wild and the gentle live together now, not by design, but by rhythm. The fire has turned to lamplight, the fields to floors, the hunters to dreamers, yet the agreement holds as it always has, silent, effortless, and eternal. Over time, the quiet presence of the cat began to move beyond survival. Its shape appeared not only in doorways and granaries, but also in the things people made. In the soft lines of pottery, in the curve of jewelry, in the rhythm of weaving, the image of the cat began to settle into human hands. It was no longer only a hunter or a shadow, it had become a symbol of balance itself. Artists did not paint it to worship it. They painted it because its stillness reminded them of grace. The human eye, drawn to proportion and silence, found both in the animal that lived beside it, yet remained untamed. The arch of a cat's back mirrored the arch of a bridge. The turn of its head echoed the lines of sculpture. In its movements there was no waste, no noise, only intention. A step, a pause, a glance, every gesture felt deliberate. Civilization learned from that economy. Painters softened their strokes, carvers curved their lines, and in every corner of the ancient world, the cat lingered, quiet but shaping taste itself. The artisans of the early cities must have watched it closely. The way it rested in sunlight, its muscles hidden beneath the calm of fur, its gaze both near and far at once. They began to understand beauty not as decoration but as restraint. The cat, without meaning to, redefined elegance. It taught that strength could look like composure, that movement could carry weight even in stillness. Across generations, the animal's image moved with trade and travel. It appeared etched on metal, painted on tiles, embroidered into robes. Sometimes it guarded the corner of a room. Sometimes it simply lounged in the border of a design, always poised, always detached. Wherever its likeness appeared, people seemed to breathe a little slower, as if reminded that calm could be an art form. Even in bustling markets or crowded ports, a single cat sitting motionless on a crate could command attention more than the loudest merchant. Its silence made people look. In that gaze, they found something that cities often lost: simplicity. A kind of quiet that did not ask to be noticed, yet became impossible to ignore. That was the beginning of aesthetic influence, the realization that beauty could whisper and still change a room. Writers, too, began to take notice. In clay tablets and early scripts, the cat appeared as a metaphor for patience, for independence, for the quiet intelligence that observes rather than interferes. It stood for the soul that could move through chaos without losing itself. Unlike the horse, which symbolized power, or the dog, which represented loyalty, the cat came to mean something subtler, a sense of self-containment, an awareness that peace can exist apart from control. Through centuries of expansion, conquest, and invention, the cat never had to adapt to fit human pride. It simply stayed what it was, and in doing so, it shaped human imagination. Even as tools changed and empires rose, its form persisted unchanged, lithe, minimal, proportioned with the kind of symmetry that architects study and poets envy. People began to measure beauty by how easily it could exist without effort. The cat became the quiet standard. In households, its influence reached beyond art. People arranged spaces around it: soft corners by the fire, narrow shelves near windows, steps where sunlight gathered. The architecture of comfort began to echo its preferences. Fabrics were chosen not only for warmth, but for the way they invited rest. The rhythm of daily life slowed, adjusted to the presence of something that refused to be hurried. A cat resting in a home changed its sound. Footsteps softened, voices dropped. Even children learned instinctively to whisper near it. Its breathing set the tempo of the afternoon. It reminded people that peace was not the absence of movement, but the presence of grace. Without meaning to, the animal became the measure of tranquility. Travelers wrote about it in their notes, describing how every land seemed to have its own version: short-haired, long-haired, spotted, or striad, but all carrying the same composure. They lived among fishermen by the coast, among farmers in the fields, among poets in stone cities. Some perched on windowsills overlooking harbors, watching ships come and go with the same indifference to time. Some slept in libraries, surrounded by parchment and dust. Wherever they appeared, the world seemed to steady itself around them. It was said that even when empires fell, cats remained. They walked over ruins and rebuilt towns alike, threading history with quiet continuity. To watch one move was to glimpse a kind of memory, not of a single life, but of a way of being that had survived everything. They carried no nostalgia, no regret, only presence. That perhaps is why they fascinated artists and thinkers. They embodied what humans could imagine but rarely achieve: permanence through detachment. As centuries passed, painters and poets no longer needed to explain their presence. A cat in a composition spoke for itself. It could mean mystery, solitude, contentment, or even defiance, depending on the light. In a crowded room, it was stillness. In a lonely one, it was company. Always it held the balance, and though people rarely said it aloud, they had begun to see a reflection of their own longing in its form, the wish to live in the world without being consumed by it. In literature, cats became symbols of observation. They saw what others ignored, and they saw it without judgment. Writers placed them beside their characters to remind readers of perspective, of the silent witness in every human story. Painters, too, used them as anchors of calm. In scenes of feasts or gardens, a cat often sat near the edge, looking away from the noise, holding the composition steady. The influence spread quietly, the way all profound things do. From art to gesture, from furniture to fashion, the feline grace infused design itself. The folds of robes began to echo, the drape of fur, the posture of sculptures mirrored the curve of a spine at rest. Even language changed. Words for elegance, for independence, for poise often carried feline roots. Humanity, without knowing it, had shaped its sense of beauty around an animal that refused to perform. And yet, through all these reflections and imitations, the cat remained the same. It slept beside artists, crossed the work tables of craftsmen, wandered through workshops and markets, unnoticed except when it paused to stare. The world kept trying to define it, but it never agreed to be defined. Its simplicity protected it from meaning too much. It existed, and that was enough. In every era, its influence endured not through worship or fear, but through presence. It stood as a reminder that form can speak without sound, that stillness can lead movement, and that perfection often lies not in completion, but in restraint. When the day's noise faded and lamps flickered low, people still found themselves drawn to that quiet shape at the edge of the room. The soft outline of fur and breath, the steady rhythm of life untroubled by time. They did not call it divine, though something in them understood that calm is its own kind of holiness. In the silence between heartbeat and breath, the cat taught the oldest lesson of art, that to endure beautifully, one must learn to simply be. They spread the way wind spreads seed, quietly, inevitably. On ships that carried grain and spices where the sound of waves met the scurry of rats, cats became part of the crew. They did not sign on, nor were they trained. They simply appeared one day on a deck, eyes narrow against the sun, and made themselves useful. The sailors, practical men who trusted what worked, kept them. They called them good luck, but luck had nothing to do with it. The cats earned their passage with patience, hunting by moonlight while the ship rocked gently beneath the stars. From those wooden vessels, the first feline travelers stepped into the harbors of the ancient world. They arrived in Crete and Cyprus, then in the markets of Phoenicia, where the smell of fish and resin hung in the air. They followed traders to the islands of the Aegean, to Greece and Rome, to the far edges of the Mediterranean, where languages changed, but the sound of mice was the same. Each time a new port welcomed a ship, a cat would slip down the gangplank, vanish between the crates, and begin its quiet work. By the time the sailors noticed, it was too late to call it wild. It had already found another home. They adapted easily because they never asked to belong. In temples and taverns, in workshops and warehouses, they appeared as though they had always been there. A small shadow in a doorway, a pair of eyes reflecting lamplight, a shape that turned soundlessly and disappeared. People started to believe that cats could find their way anywhere. Some said they could cross oceans without maps, guided only by instinct. Others said they simply went where they were needed, following the scent of food and survival. Both were true in their own way. The first Greek poets noticed them too. They wrote of creatures that carried the balance of night within their bodies, that could sit among marble columns and look older than the gods themselves. The Greeks admired proportion, and in the cat they saw it made flesh. Its movements were geometry softened by breath. To them it embodied the very thing philosophers sought, harmony between thought and action. The way it walked, the way it paused, seemed like proof that discipline and freedom could live together. In Rome, the cats were called mures bellator, warriors against mice. They roamed granaries and bathhouses, theatres and gardens. Some belonged to soldiers, sleeping beside their shields in the barracks. Others shared villas with the wealthy, resting on tiled floors while servants carried wine. The Romans valued control, yet here was a creature that defied it, and they loved it for that. A senator could command legions, but not the cat, sleeping on his scrolls. It came and went as it pleased, leaving paw prints on wax tablets, proof that even in the heart of order, a little chaos was welcome. As empires grew, so did the reach of the cat. They crossed deserts on caravans, curled in baskets beside jars of grain. They lived in the folds of silk and the shadows of spice stalls. Their fur gathered the scent of cinnamon, olive oil, and salt. They were part of the invisible map of trade, small, silent ambassadors moving through the corridors of civilization. They left no written record, but they were there in every transaction, keeping the balance between hunger and abundance. In time, they reached northern lands where winters were long and fires burned low. There, their fur thickened, their eyes grew rounder to catch what little light remained. Farmers welcomed them into barns where their breath rose in small clouds of warmth against the cold air. The cats slept beside stored grain and the slow heartbeat of cows. To watch them hunt was to see purpose in its purest form, swift, precise, and without cruelty. They killed not for sport, but to restore quiet. In that stillness, humans found comfort. When ships began to venture farther than anyone had dreamed, carrying goods beyond the edges of the known world, cats went with them. They stood on the prows of vessels bound for new continents, fur ruffled by salt wind, eyes half closed against the horizon. In every port, they began again. Their presence made strange lands familiar, as if civilization itself had arrived when the first cat set paw on foreign soil. Even where language failed, the gesture remained the same. A bowl of food left by the door, a cautious blink returned. In that small exchange, the bond renewed itself. Empires changed, flags rose and fell, but the understanding endured. Cats followed the rhythm of human movement without ever surrendering to it. They were part of the world's expansion, yet untouched by its ambition. Everywhere they went, they carried a piece of calm with them. In the roar of ports, in the rattle of markets, in the whisper of desert winds, their silence was steady. People began to notice that wherever cats settled, anxiety seemed to ease. Perhaps it was their composure, or perhaps it was the reminder that even amid chaos, there existed a creature that refused to rush. Their fur gathered the dust of empires, their eyes reflected centuries of change, yet they themselves remained the same. They asked for little, demanded less, and gave what humans could never give each other, and the feeling that life could still be simple. They slept on maps that redrew the world, on parchment that recorded conquest, on wooden decks that bridged continents. While kings declared victory, a cat yawned in the sun, and the world went on. By the time the age of exploration began, they had become part of the global heartbeat. They traveled with traders, explorers, even exiles, bringing with them not ownership, but continuity. Wherever humanity went, a cat followed, carrying silence like a flag. Some lived in coastal towns, their fur bleached pale by sea air. Others roamed the inland fields, blending into earth and grass. And though no one could track their paths, they seemed to always arrive first, as if the world itself unfolded beneath their paws. In the endless motion of trade, the cat remained the still point. A reminder that presence need not mean control, that the truest form of companionship is simply coexistence. The sailors who once kept them for luck began to notice their other gift, the ability to make any place feel like home. A quiet creature sitting by a lamp could turn a ship's cabin into a sanctuary, a strange port into a familiar street. As centuries passed, their image began to appear again, carved into furniture, painted on ceramics, stitched into the edges of cloth, not as gods now, nor as symbols of superstition, but as markers of calm, of home, of continuity. The cat was no longer a visitor, it was part of the human story, woven through trade routes and sea winds, through the rise and fall of kingdoms. It had conquered the world without intending to, not by force, but by patience. And still it walks that same ancient path, between the noise of survival and the quiet of grace, carrying with it the memory of sails and stars, of cities built and forgotten, of nights when the only sound was the sea and the soft footfall of something wild that chose once again to stay. They reached the lands of marble and reason, where people built symmetry into their cities and called it civilization. Before the cats arrived, the Greeks had relied on weasels to guard their granaries, small, frantic creatures that bit too often and slept too little. Then came the quiet newcomers from the south, sleek and deliberate, with paws that made no sound and eyes that seemed to weigh the world before moving through it. The change was immediate. Where the weasels brought noise, the cats brought order. The sound of squeaks faded from storage rooms, and in their place came silence, a soft stillness that suited the Greek sense of balance. They fit naturally into that world of columns and courtyards. Philosophers admired their restraint, artists studied their posture. A cat could hold still longer than a statue, and when it moved, it did so with geometry in its spine. Every curve and turn carried purpose. To watch one stretch beneath the olive trees was to witness discipline disguised as ease. The Greeks, who loved form as much as meaning, saw in the animal a reflection of their own pursuit of harmony, the measured line between chaos and control. In Athens, they wandered among the white steps, weaving between sandals and shadows. No one tried to train them, no one dared. They were not servants, not decorations, but participants in the slow rhythm of the polis. Children followed them through the streets, and poets compared their gaze to the calm of the sea at dusk. When a cat rested in a marketplace, merchants lowered their voices without knowing why. Something in its stillness demanded gentleness. The Romans, ever practical, noticed the usefulness first. They called them guardians of grain, soldiers against the small, unseen armies that threatened the empire's food supply. The cats worked quietly in the granaries and the docks, keeping the balance between abundance and ruin. Yet even the most pragmatic Romans found themselves captivated. Their villas, once filled with dogs bred for loyalty and display, soon welcomed the smaller creature that neither obeyed nor begged. A patrician might rise early to read a scroll, the dawn light spilling over the mosaic floor, and find a cat already waiting, its tail curled like punctuation. They appeared in every part of Roman life, in bathhouses, temples, and theatres. Sailors brought them aboard ships, soldiers kept them in camps, and market women fed them scraps near the fountains. No one could quite claim them. They belonged to themselves, and yet they belonged everywhere. In a city that celebrated power and order, the cat was an acceptable form of rebellion. It obeyed no master, but still kept the empire clean. To artists, it became an emblem of poise. Mosaics depicted them mid-step, turning their heads toward unseen movement. Sculptors shaped them in marble with the same reverence they gave to heroes, though smaller, subtler, as if acknowledging that grace could exist without grandeur. Painters captured the shimmer of fur with the same pigments used for sunlight. The cat, by doing nothing more than existing, became part of the visual language of elegance. Even philosophers took note. Seneca once wrote that serenity was the rarest strength, the ability to remain unmoved amid confusion. Though he never mentioned cats, one imagines he might have understood them. They embodied that principle without effort. They did not argue, they demonstrated. A creature that could sit among Roman noise and remain untouched had already mastered the art of the Stoics. In the working quarters of the empire, the bakeries, the warehouses, the stables, the cats were less symbols than companions. They moved like shadows between sacks of grain, slept among amphorae of oil, and greeted the night with quiet patrols. Workers grew used to them, began to leave crumbs or fish bones at the door. It was not affection at first, only gratitude, but gratitude repeated daily becomes tenderness. Soon, when the fires dimmed and the last carts rolled home, a cat would be seen curling beside a pair of worn sandals, its body forming the shape of rest itself. In the villas of the wealthy, they reclined on cushions beside painted walls. Guests would remark on their composure, how they seemed to listen without caring. Hosts, amused, took pride in their indifference. The presence of a cat meant refinement, proof that a household could afford serenity. Unlike peacocks or lapdogs, they required nothing extravagant, only warmth, a quiet corner, and the courtesy of being left alone. The Romans, who valued efficiency in all things, could not help admiring a creature that achieved perfection with so little effort. As the empire expanded, cats traveled with it, carried in baskets and ships, hidden among the cargo of conquest. They stepped onto new shores with the same calm they had shown on marble floors. In Gaul, they learned to sleep through rain. In Britannia, they learned the scent of peat and frost. Everywhere they went, they adapted without surrender. Their silence translated better than any language. In the northern provinces, farmers began to see them as quiet allies. A cat in a barn was worth more than a dozen traps. They guarded grain as faithfully as any hired hand, yet asked for nothing more than a patch of straw and a share of warmth. Some households began to mark their doors with symbols resembling feline footprints, believing it invited prosperity. Others simply felt safer with one nearby, as if the small heartbeat in the corner kept misfortune itself at bay. Over time, the distinction between practical and poetic blurred. What began as pest control became companionship. What began as necessity became affection. The Romans, whose roads bound the world together, had also spread something softer, the habit of coexistence. A soldier returning from a campaign might carry home a kitten found in a foreign port. A merchant might keep one in his shop to remind him of calmer places. The empire's reach was vast, but wherever humans settled, the cats settled too, as if the story of civilization required them. In the evenings, when the city quieted and lamps flickered in the courtyards, their silhouettes appeared on walls, stretching like living hieroglyphs. They watched the streets, the stars, the sleeping world. The same eyes that once glowed in desert sand now shone over cobblestone and marble. They had crossed continents without maps, crossed centuries without change. Their journey was not one of conquest, but of calm, spreading not by command, but by comfort. Even after the empires cracked and their cities turned to dust, the cats remained. They walked across fallen columns, slept in the ruins of baths, prowled the empty forums where senators once spoke. History moved on, but they did not hurry to follow. Wherever people rebuilt, they returned, slipping through doorways like memory itself. The same balance that once ruled Greece and Rome, the pursuit of form, of order, of grace, still lived in them. And so they endured, the quiet companions of a restless species, reminding humanity of something it too easily forgot. That elegance needs no witness, that usefulness can live beside beauty, and that peace, once invited, has a way of staying. Far to the east, beyond deserts and mountains, another kind of cat was learning to live beside people in a different rhythm of survival. In the warm valleys where water shimmered across rice fields, farmers faced a quieter but constant battle. The granaries were full, and the nights were alive with the soft scratching of rodents. Into this world came the Asian leopard cat, smaller, sharper, its coat dappled like broken sunlight. It did not approach villages as the African wildcat had done. It lingered at their edges, watching from the wet grass, patient and distrustful. The farmers noticed that where this spotted hunter prowled, the rats vanished. It moved like water itself, silent between the reeds, its eyes pale gold in the moonlight. No one tried to tame it. They left offerings, a few grains, a bowl of leftovers, and the cat, after long hesitation, accepted. It was not a friendship, not even a truce. It was coexistence, written in silence. The people worked the land and the cat guarded it. They shared the same rhythm, early dawn, heavy rain, the hum of insects, the quiet of dusk. Over generations, something subtle began to shift. Among the wild litters born near the fields, a few were calmer. They lingered closer to the huts, returning to familiar places rather than the forest. Their young grew up hearing the sound of human voices as part of the world, neither threat nor promise. Slowly, a small branch of the wild became less wild. The bond was fragile, almost invisible, but it held. These eastern cats were never fully tamed. They kept the forest in their eyes. They would vanish for days, return lean and calm, and sit by the threshold as though deciding whether to stay. To the farmers, they were neither pets nor possessions. They were spirits of the fields, protectors of grain and fortune. People began to weave their image into small charms, to carve them into wood as tokens of vigilance. Where the African cats lounged near temples, the Asian ones remained creatures of the earth, low to the ground, shaped by rain and soil. For centuries, the two worlds never met. The sleek desert hunters of Africa and the wary rice field guardians of Asia lived out separate stories, both bound to humanity, yet loyal only to themselves. Their temperaments reflected the lands that shaped them. The African wildcats were bold, sun-born, confident in open space. The Asian leopard cats were secretive, mist-born, shaped by water and shadow. Two answers to the same question of survival. Then trade began to stitch the continents together. Ships carried spices, silk and grain, and sometimes, without notice, a pair of watchful eyes hidden among the cargo. The African cats spread eastward along the trade routes, adapting easily to new climates, their temperament calmer, their trust more negotiable. They met their distant cousins in the villages of India and the markets of China, and nature did what it always does when boundaries blur. They mingled, merged, and over time, their lineages intertwined. The genes of desert and jungle braided together, each lending something to the other. The confidence of the African hunter, the agility of the Asian wanderer. From that quiet union came the modern house cat, carrying both histories in its blood, the memory of sand and the memory of rain. It could sleep on a cushion yet vanish into wilderness within a heartbeat. Even now, when it curls on a windowsill or darts through tall grass, you can see both ancestors in its movement. The grace of the plains, the secrecy of the forest. A creature balanced perfectly between worlds. It does not belong to either. It belongs only to the long patience of evolution and to the enduring truth that all companionship begins with distance and is kept alive by choice. Then came the time when light dimmed across Europe and the rhythm of reason gave way to fear. It was the age when whispers outweighed wisdom and silence itself could be mistaken for danger. The cat, once a symbol of composure and order, now moved through a world that had forgotten the balance it once shared with nature. People who no longer understood the calm of quiet creatures began to distrust what they could not command. A glance that once meant serenity was now seen as a sign of malice. Eyes that glowed softly in the dark were called unnatural. The night, which had always been their kingdom, became their sentence. In villages and towns, superstition spread like fog. Anything independent, anything that walked alone, became suspect. The cat, with its quiet self-assurance, was too calm to belong, too watchful to be loved. It did not beg, it did not serve, and in an age where obedience was called virtue, indifference was mistaken for evil. People began to drive them away. Some threw stones, some whispered that they brought misfortune. Many simply stopped feeding them. The fields grew silent, and for a while humanity believed it had rid itself of a shadow. But nature does not honor fear. It only waits. Without the cats, the balance broke. The grain that had once been safe from the teeth of the night became the banquet of rodents. Granaries filled with the sound of chewing, and the same silence that had once soothed now carried unease. Rats multiplied without pause, their small bodies slipping through streets and sewers, through kitchens and storerooms. And with them came the fleas, invisible but relentless, carrying sickness that traveled faster than rumor. It began in ports among ships heavy with trade. A few rats came ashore, each carrying a quiet disaster in its fur. From there, it spread inland, across rivers, through valleys, along the cobbled roads of empire. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and towns fell quiet not from peace but from loss. No one connected the dots. No one remembered that the quiet hunter they had cast out had been their oldest safeguard. The world had mistaken its own protector for its curse, and now the price was being collected. In the dim light of those years, entire streets stood empty. The bells of churches rang for the dead, the living locked themselves indoors, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. The Black Death had no eyes, no voice, no mercy. It came in the folds of clothing, in the breath of travelers, in the small pulse of an insect bite. It erased cities the way a wave erases footprints, and still, people blamed everything except the absence that mattered. They looked to the sky, to the stars, to omens and prayers, but not to the empty corners where once a cat's eyes had glowed. Yet even as fear ruled, survival began to whisper again. In some places people noticed that the few villages which had not driven out their cats seemed less afflicted. Their granaries remained cleaner, their homes quieter. The link was invisible but undeniable. Where the hunters returned, the sickness waned. Slowly, cautiously, people began to feed them again. A bowl of milk left by the door, a scrap of food placed quietly at night. The cats, indifferent to human guilt, accepted the offerings without reproach. They slipped back into the streets, lean and deliberate, as if nothing had happened. The balance reasserted itself not with triumph, but with quiet inevitability. The rats dwindled, the fleas lost their carriers, and the fever that had raged like fire began to cool. The people did not celebrate, they only sighed, exhausted by their own ignorance. They had learned without sermons or scripture the simplest ecological truth, that nature needs cooperation, not conquest, that even silence has its purpose, that removing what seems unnecessary can unmake what holds the world together. The cats, of course, asked for no thanks. They did not demand forgiveness or loyalty. They returned, as they always had, because there was work to do. They stalked the alleys, the barns, the docks, their movement steady and unhurried. In a continent that had buried its arrogance under plague and ash, they were the first to walk freely again. Their paws touched streets that humans feared to cross. They reminded the living that restoration begins quietly, one heartbeat, one breath, one soft step at a time. Over time, people began to see them differently. Artists painted them into the corners of domestic scenes, symbols not of superstition, but of order restored. Farmers spoke of them with a kind of reverence, understanding at last that harmony was not a luxury, but survival itself. In cities, they became companions once more, lean shadows curling on windowsills, guardians of libraries, watchers of ships and granaries. And though few spoke of it openly, there lingered a quiet gratitude. The plague had been a mirror showing humanity what happened when fear replaced understanding. By the dawn of a gentler age, the cat's image softened again. It appeared in tapestries and stories, in the margins of manuscripts where monks illuminated not only saints, but creatures that kept them company through long sleepless nights. The cat was no longer an omen, but a presence, a reminder that nature endures, that order returns, that life rebuilds itself in silence after chaos has burned through everything else. Even now, centuries later, that lesson remains. Every time a cat curls by a hearth, every time it walks through a street with unhurried steps, it carries the echo of that long correction. The world learned through suffering what coexistence means, that arrogance breaks what patience mends, that control is never stronger than balance. The cat did not forgive, but it stayed. It hunted, it rested, it watched. It reminded humanity without words or vengeance that harmony is not a gift, but a responsibility, and that the smallest life left to do its quiet work can hold an entire world together. When the world began to mend itself after centuries of loss, the cats did not return in triumph. They simply appeared again, quiet as dusk, walking through rebuilt streets as if they had never left. In the villages, they slept in barns beside grain sacks, their breath rising like smoke in the morning light. In the cities, they wandered through libraries and workshops, unbothered by the clatter of printing presses or the hum of conversation. To live beside humans had never required loyalty. It required rhythm, the same steady balance of patience and presence that had always guided them. The New World was busier, filled with ships and books, trade routes and discoveries. Yet wherever people went, the cats went too, following the quiet logic of necessity. In the ports of Amsterdam, Lisbon and London, they moved among ropes and crates, keeping the docks alive but clean. Sailors left milk on the decks before voyages, believing it brought luck, though what it really brought was fewer rats in the hold. In the great warehouses of the age of trade, cats patrolled the aisles like silent inspectors, their bodies lean and their eyes sharp as lanterns. They were not worshipped now nor feared, just trusted, the most natural kind of reverence. In homes, they learned to dwell among people without belonging to them. They chose their spots carefully, a patch of sunlight on the floor, the edge of a chair, the foot of a bed. They slept through storms, ignored shouting, and occasionally opened one eye to watch the world behave exactly as it always had, restless, loud, and temporary. Humans began to see something enviable in that calm. While they chased progress and profit, the cat remained content to exist. No ambitions, no possessions, only the quiet mastery of the moment. Writers noticed, painters noticed. They began to leave small traces. A cat curled at the feet of a scholar in a study, a shadow slipping through the corner of a domestic scene, a glimmer of eyes on a windowsill under moonlight. It became a symbol of reflection, of thought that moved without noise. To read beside a cat was to be reminded that peace could live even in movement, that the world outside could rage while one small life remained perfectly still. As centuries turned, their role shifted from guardian to companion. Yet even as they accepted the warmth of the hearth, they never surrendered their solitude. They came when they wished, left when they wished, and taught by example that affection is not ownership. They slept beside poets who worked until dawn, beside sailors returned from the sea, beside children who dreamed of faraway lands. They never asked for more than warmth, and yet somehow gave people the comfort of being quietly understood. In the age of discovery, when humans mapped continents and crossed oceans, the cats remained the same, unbothered by empire or invention. They lived in monasteries and ships, in kitchens and classrooms. They kept company with the lonely and the curious alike. A cat could sit by a philosopher's lamp, listen to theories of existence, and blink once in timeless indifference. It did not need to argue, it simply was. And in that stillness, it reminded humanity of a truth deeper than reason, that life, even when tamed, is still wild at the edges. By the time the modern world arrived, with its clocks and machines and restless lights, cats had fully settled into their chosen place, half domestic, half free. They watched from windows as carriages became trains, as candles gave way to electricity, as the world brightened and quickened and forgot how to pause. Yet they remained the same creatures that once walked the grain fields of the Fertile Crescent, the temples of Egypt, the villas of Rome. Their paws were soft, their gaze unbroken, their patience older than civilization itself. In every library one could find a cat stretched across a stack of papers, its tail flicking like a metronome of calm. In every port one lingered near the warehouses, watching the ships with the same quiet understanding that had once kept empires alive. In every home they carried the same subtle contract. You may feed me, but I belong to no one. Their presence turned rooms into sanctuaries, their silence into rest. Even now, when they curl on a couch or return proudly with a small gift from the garden, they are continuing a story written long before memory. It is not about ownership or dependence, but coexistence. Two species sharing the same shelter, learning the same lesson again and again, that peace is not found in command, but in respect. And as night falls somewhere, a cat settles by the window. Beyond the glass, the world hums with its endless noise, but inside, the air is still. The lamp glows, the pages turn, and the creature that once walked through deserts and dynasties closes its eyes. Its purr fills the quiet, steady and eternal, the softest reminder that harmony, when finally understood, makes no sound at all. They returned quietly, as if they had never left. The streets had changed, the roofs were new, and yet the cats moved through them with the same unhurried grace, their paws remembering every path that stone and dust had ever known. After centuries of fear and fever, they came back without announcement, slipping through doorways, climbing fences, resting in the light that fell across rebuilt walls. No one invited them, but no one turned them away either. They arrived the way dawn does, naturally, without need for reason. In the morning, you could see them near the barns, stretching among sacks of grain that still carried the scent of winter. In the evenings, they sat beneath the lamplight, shadows inside shadows, watching people return from their work. They didn't ask for affection, they didn't seek forgiveness, they simply resumed what they had always done, the quiet labor of keeping balance. The world had burned and healed, but the rhythm between human and animal endured, soft as breath. People said little about their return. They left small bowls by the door, a piece of bread soaked in milk, a whisper of gratitude not spoken aloud. And in that silence, something ancient stirred again, the memory of coexistence, of sharing the same warmth without demand. As time moved forward, the world began to rush again. Ships left ports heavy with trade, cities grew crowded with ambition, words like progress and reason filled the air. But still, beneath the noise, the cats walked in their slow, deliberate rhythm. They didn't hurry to keep up. They had already survived everything. They sat on windowsills and rooftops, listening to bells and rain, letting human history pass like weather. Painters began to notice them first. A dark figure curled near an open book. A cat beneath the table where a philosopher wrote until dawn. In each image, it was never the center, but the pause, the breath between thoughts. Poets saw the same thing, the calm that lives within motion, the creature that never asks the world to quiet down, yet somehow makes it do so. People began to envy that stillness, the way a cat could belong everywhere and nowhere at once. To them, it was freedom. To the cat, it was simply being. In its eyes, the centuries meant nothing. Empires had come and gone, plagues had risen and faded, yet there it was, alive, composed, perfectly content in its small domain of sunlight and shadow. And sometimes, in that stillness, humanity remembered how to listen again. The sound of a purr was not only comfort but continuity, a reminder that life persists not through conquest but through patience. The world had spent generations trying to master everything that moved. The cat, by doing nothing, taught it how to live again. Beyond the cities, in the open fields where the wind was wider and the sky unbroken, other rhythms continued. The earth there had no fences, the grass rolled like waves, endless and untamed. And across that vastness moved another companion of humankind, not silent like the cat, but steady as heartbeat, carrying centuries on its back. The horses of the steppe had never known walls. Their hooves read the land like scripture, each step a conversation with distance. In winter, they dug through ice for the thin grass beneath. In summer, they ran until their breath became part of the wind. To the nomads who followed them, they were not property, but kin. A Mongol child learned balance before language, learning to ride before knowing how to walk. Fear had no place there, only rhythm, the pulse between rider and horse that turned survival into grace. They shared the same simplicity the cats once carried into human homes, presence without possession. The herds roamed freely, yet each man and woman could recognize their own by the sound of a neigh, the tilt of an ear, the shape of a stride against the horizon. No ownership was needed, recognition was enough. When the wind swept over the steppe, it carried the sound of thousands of hooves, but there was no chaos in it, only order shaped by instinct. The horses moved like weather, guided by trust, not command. They taught their riders what every creature that endures must learn, that strength is not domination, but harmony with what cannot be controlled. At dusk, the camps glowed with small fires. The smell of milk and smoke mingled in the air. Riders hummed to calm their mounts, low tones that blended with the wind until no one could tell where voice ended and nature began. Children slept wrapped in felt beside the warmth of breathing animals, their dreams filled with motion, the endless running that defined their lives. The cats of the Western world and the horses of the Eastern plains were born from the same quiet truth. Life continues when it listens to itself. A horse did not serve its rider. It carried a life alongside another. When storms came, they faced them together. When hunger returned, they shared what could be spared. The Mongols said the steppe raised both man and beast, that the sky judged them equally. The cat's wisdom was solitude, the horse's wisdom was motion. One taught stillness, the other taught endurance. Both were forms of peace. Sometimes when the wind changed, it seemed as if these two rhythms, one slow, one swift, spoke to each other across continents. The purr of a cat in a quiet room and the distant echo of hooves over the plain were made of the same thing, breath made steady by trust. Humanity had always lived between them, drawn to both, the creature that stayed and the creature that carried it away. The Mongols believed every horse carried a fragment of the eternal sky, a spirit that watched and remembered. That belief was not worship, it was gratitude. To strike a horse in anger was a sin. To lose one through carelessness was shame. They understood that companionship was not built on mastery, but on attention, the same kind that once made early farmers leave grain for wildcats under the moon. Across the centuries, that pattern never broke. People built empires, ships, machines, but the same quiet exchange remained, food for protection, shelter for trust. Whether it was a cat at the foot of a bed or a horse beneath a rider, the lesson was unchanged. What you care for cares for you in return, not through words or promises, but through presence. In the deep night, the steppe cooled, the fires dimmed. Somewhere a mare bent her head to the earth, her breath fogging against the frost. A herdsman looked up at the stars and thought of his ancestors, their paths written in hoof prints rather than ink. He could not read or write, yet he understood permanence better than any scholar. It was not in the monuments or the laws, but in the rhythm that passed from one generation to the next, the rhythm of motion and trust. Far away, in a city that had forgotten how to see the stars, a cat leapt softly from one rooftop to another. The air was thick with smoke, the streets glowed with new lamps, but the motion was the same, quiet, precise, eternal. Different worlds, same balance. One creature carrying, one creature watching, both reminding humanity of what it means to belong without binding. And when morning returned, both were still there. The cat stretched beneath the window, the horse shook frost from its mane. The world turned, and they endured, not as servants, not as symbols, but as witnesses. To live beside them was to be reminded of the gentler laws that survive all empires, that patience outlasts power, and that peace, once found, needs no language. They say that people learn from animals by imitation, but what lasts is what we learn by breathing with them. And so when the riders began to gather at the edge of morning, they did not tighten their hands on the reins as if grasp could create trust. They settled their weight, matched the horse's quiet stance, and let the pulse under the saddle teach them what the wind already knew. Somewhere between hoofbeat and heartbeat a language formed, not of commands but of replies, and boys became men by listening to it. In a stony valley where the air carried the taste of river dust, young pages stood in a line and watched veterans mount in one unbroken motion. The lesson was not speed, but calm. A steady horse cannot be hurried, and a steady man does not hurry himself. What looked like courage from far away was up close, a well-practiced peace, the kind that keeps a formation intact when the ground is uneven and the future uncertain. The companions who rode together understood that friendship on the ground becomes survival in motion. Each gesture, each breath was a promise. I will hold the line with you and you will hold it with me. Before they learned to lean into the charge, They learned to lean into one another's presence. They shared water, shade, and small jokes that eased the weight of armor. They shared silences longer than speeches, the kind that let a thought settle without being shaken apart by noise. When the sun was low, they circled the horses and loosened girths, rubbing sweat to salt with rough cloth, checking hooves, watching eyes. A good rider carried his own tiredness lightly, and his horse's tiredness carefully. The animals rested knowing the men were near. The men rested because they trusted the animals to notice what men might miss. A shift of wind, a distant rhythm, the tremor of feet approaching along a dry channel. No one called this faith. It was closer than faith and less dramatic. It was habit, the most durable form of devotion. At night, the camp breathed like a single body. Fires in small bowls, meat sizzling, a thin tune carried by a reed. Cups were raised and lowered without ceremony, and the circle tightened in warmth. If a story was told, it lived in the voice of whoever had the most patient breath. The younger ones listened and saw the tale in the glow on a cheekbone, in the glint along a bronze rim, in the shadow that flickered over a hand. What the elders wanted them to learn was not victory but posture, how to face what comes without lunging at it, how to bow the head when the horse shies, how to straighten when fear wishes to bend you. They slept with their cloaks around their shoulders and their saddles at their feet, lulled by the soft shifting of animals and the hiss of ash. In the early light, there was no trumpet, only the small ceremony of readiness repeated 100 ways, tightening a strap, tying a thong, smoothing a mane, sliding a toe into a stirrup, exhaling once to measure the day. When they moved as a pattern rather than as individuals, a shape cut into the air and stitched by confidence. The point of the spear that everyone admired was only the visible edge of a weaving done by many hands, by riders matching angles and distances, by horses reading one another's shoulders, by quiet decisions made in the space between eye and wrist. The young discovered that bravery was less a flame than a weight, something you carry evenly so it does not crush you or swing you off balance. They learned that a steady gaze steadies the horse, that a calm mouth calms the men to either side, and that the loudest thing a leader can offer is often silence well kept, at the moment others want to speak. When they returned from long marches, no one shouted. The first gift was water for the horses, the second was a shaded place for the saddles, the third was a hand on a friend's shoulder that said, "Both welcome and I know." They ate in the dust, not as nobles or servants, but as travelers who had brought one another safely from one horizon to the next. If a song rose, it rose from the back of the circle and moved forward like a tide, carrying names that mattered and the names of those who were missed. The earth beneath them remembered every hoof, every step, and the air remembered every breath they had dared to take together. In those hours, the line between animal and human thinned to a thread. The horse borrowed the man's intention, the man borrowed the horse's steadiness, and inside that exchange lived the gentle authority that never needs to raise its voice. In time, the pages became companions, not by rank alone, but by the way they were recognized in the glance of the riders around them. Here is someone who will not break the pattern, who will not rush the slow moment or slow the urgent one. The test was not a single feat, but an accumulation of small fidelities, keeping your place, minding your mount, remembering to laugh when food was poor and the road longer than maps admitted. The best of them had a softness that survived every hard day. They could stroke a nervous foal and then hold a line on a ridge without losing breath. Their hands could lift a friend from the ground and tie a knot that would hold in rain. They learned to be exact without being brittle. They learned that strength, like leather, stays truest when kept supple. When a messenger arrived from far provinces or a trader from the coast brought news salted by distance, the companions listened with their heads slightly tilted, as if the future were a bird on a high branch. They did not leap, they marked. A plan to move was made in the same tone as a plan to rest. If you watched from a hill, you would see geometry without edges, the wedge forming and dissolving, lines opening and closing, a calm heart beating under the noise of hooves. Those who walked beside the column, porters, cooks, smiths, felt safer because the riders' quiet discipline made a shape for the day, a promise that chaos would be kept away from the center where bread was baked and iron cooled. The riders were not statues. They shifted weight as the ground changed. They spoke to their horses as you might speak to a child who wakes in the night. I am here, we are moving, the dark is only a place we pass through. On the evenings before difficult days, they gathered again, not out of ritual, but rhythm. A low murmur would pass through the camp, a few sparks rising from the fires, and the smell of smoke blending with the scent of horsehair and wool. It was not celebration, but an easing of the body before the world asked too much of it again. They shared what they had, a skin of milk, a small loaf, dried meat, softened by firelight. Each gesture, slow and unhurried, carried the same quiet gratitude. Thank you for still being here. Thank you for not breaking. When the moon rose, they fell into the same stories they had told 100 times before. The ones about beginnings, about fathers who never came home, about horses that found their way back without a rider. They spoke softly, as if the words might scare the peace away. A few of them mended straps or blades, their hands moving by memory. The horses nearby shifted, tails flicking at flies, the sound of their breathing matching the rhythm of the men's voices. It was a kind of harmony born from fatigue, a shared pulse that made everyone feel less alone. At dawn they rose without being called. The mist was thin and silver, curling low across the plain. Hooves brushed dew from the grass, and the world smelled clean for a moment. No one shouted orders. They didn't need to. Each man knew his place, his role, his weight in the formation. It was not obedience, it was understanding. The horses moved before the riders asked, the riders steadied themselves before fear could arrive, and so they set off again, a line of figures fading slowly into the pale horizon, where land and sky were the same color. By midday the wind changed, carrying dust and the faint trace of something burning far away. They did not speak of it. Instead, they adjusted their scarves, squinted into the brightness, and kept riding. Their silence was not fear, it was focus, the sound of lives too practiced to waste on panic. They knew that the world was large, that the steppe could stretch for weeks without mercy. Yet there was comfort in that vastness, because the horizon, for all its distance, was honest. It never promised safety, only space. In the stillness of afternoon, when heat shimmered on the plain and even the horses grew slow, they found shade beneath the curve of a low ridge. Someone poured water into a hollowed horn, passing it from hand to hand. A few drank, others only wet their lips. The horses stood with heads low, eyes half closed, tails moving lazily through the air. For a while, nothing happened. That was the point. They had learned that survival was not just motion, but pause, the stillness that allows the body to keep going, the silence that lets the world breathe around you. When evening came, the light stretched long and amber across the plain. The riders dismounted and walked beside their horses, letting the animals rest before dark. The sound of hooves softened into dust. Somewhere a bird called once, twice, and then was quiet. The air cooled, and the day slipped away without ceremony. They had no need for grand farewells. The road itself was the only witness. In the camp that night, a few fires glowed low. The men spoke less than usual. Some cleaned their tack. Others leaned back against saddles, watching the sparks rise and vanish. It was in these small hours that thoughts drifted homeward, to the smell of bread, to laughter, to faces blurred by time. No one mentioned it aloud, but every man carried a name in his heart, someone or something that made the long road worth returning to. Above them, the stars gathered quietly, uncountable and close. Sometimes, when the night was windless, the sound of a distant river reached the camp, soft and uneven. It reminded them of movement even when they were still. A few of the younger ones whispered about omens, how the water's voice could mean good fortune or change. But the older men only listened without comment. They had learned that not every sign needs to be read. Some things are meant to be heard and then left alone, like the sigh of an animal settling down to sleep. Before sleep, the riders checked the horses one last time, running hands along their flanks, murmuring words that were half comfort, half routine. The animals leaned gently into the touch, as if the warmth between them was enough to hold off the chill. And perhaps it was. Because on that open land, where distance erased all lines between human and creature, every small kindness became a kind of shelter. Later, as the fires dimmed and the night deepened, the men lay close to the earth, their bodies outlined by the faint glow of embers. Above them, clouds drifted slow, revealing and covering stars in turn. The air had the clean, thin scent of dust, cooling after heat. Somewhere, a horse snorted softly and turned in its sleep. The sound was enough to ease the last tension in their shoulders. One by one, the breaths of men and animals began to merge until the camp was no longer many bodies, but one. The rhythm of sleep spread like a tide across the plain. Even the wind seemed to listen. It brushed through the grass and carried with it the faint scent of smoke, the quiet memory of all the roads that had led them here. And when the moon lifted high, casting its pale reflection over the curve of the steppe, there was no boundary left, no command, no distance, no separation. Only movement turned to rest, effort turned to breath, life turned to something still and endless. The horses stood like shadows, heads lowered, eyes half-lidded. The men, wrapped in their cloaks, drifted into sleep, their dreams following the same invisible path that the wind traced through the grass. By the time dawn began again at the edge of the world, everything had already begun moving once more. The slow rise of mist, the stretch of muscles, the quiet readiness that never truly ended. The world, as always, began in silence.